Nobody in the garage expected to see her there. Not at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, with her sleeves rolled up and grease already staining her uniform. The other girls barely looked up when she walked in. Just another recruit, they thought, probably struggling with her first engine assignment. What they couldn't have imagined was that the young woman quietly reaching for a wrench was 18-year-old Princess Elizabeth, second in line to the British throne. The year was 1945. London still bore the scars of 5 years of relentless bombing. Entire neighborhoods remained nothing but rubble and memories. Food was rationed, fuel was precious, and every able-bodied person was expected to contribute to the war effort. Every person, that is, except members of the royal family. But Princess Elizabeth had other ideas. The year was 1945. London still bore the scars of 5 years of relentless bombing. Entire neighborhoods remained nothing but rubble and memories. Food was rationed, fuel was precious, and every able-bodied person was expected to contribute to the war effort. Every person, that is, except members of the royal family. But Princess Elizabeth had other ideas. It started with a conversation behind closed doors at Windsor Castle. The King, George VI, sat at his mahogany desk, papers scattered before him, casualty reports, supply shortages, requests for royal visits to boost morale. His daughter stood before him, her posture respectfully straight but her eyes blazing with determination. "Papa, I want to serve." The King looked up, his expression weary. "Lilibet, you already serve. Every appearance you make, every hospital visit, every—" "No," she interrupted, something she rarely did. "I want to serve properly. Like other girls my age." Her mother, Queen Elizabeth, entered the room at that moment, catching the tail end of the conversation. "Darling, that's simply not possible. You have duties here, responsibilities." But Princess Elizabeth had done her research. She'd spoken quietly to her private secretary, made discreet inquiries about the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the ATS. She knew that thousands of young women were training as drivers, mechanics, and radio operators. She knew they were making a real difference. "The newspapers are calling us out of touch," she said quietly. "They say the royal family doesn't understand what ordinary people are going through." "They're not wrong." The room fell silent. Outside, the distant rumble of aircraft engines reminded them all that the war was far from over. King George VI studied his daughter's face. He saw something there that reminded him of himself when he'd unexpectedly inherited the throne. A quiet resolve to do what was necessary, regardless of personal comfort. 3 weeks later, on February 24th, 1945, the announcement appeared in the Times. Her Royal Highness the Princess Elizabeth has joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service as a second subaltern and is attending a course at a driving and maintenance training center. What the newspaper didn't mention was the strict instruction given to her commanding officers. She was to be treated like any other recruit. No special privileges, no royal protocol. Just another young woman learning to fix engines and drive trucks in service of her country. The palace staff thought she'd last a week. The ATS training center near Windsor was a world away from palace life, even though it sat just 15 miles from where Princess Elizabeth had grown up. The barracks were basic, wooden huts with thin walls and thinner mattresses. The food was standard military fare, powdered eggs, watery soup, and bread that could double as ammunition if necessary. But what struck the future queen most was the freedom. For the first time in her life, she wasn't Princess Elizabeth. The other girls called her Lilibet, a family nickname she'd mentioned during introductions, and treated her exactly like everyone else. They complained about the early morning revel, grumbled about the food, and shared stories about boyfriends back home. Mary Chen, a mechanic's daughter from Liverpool, bunked next to her. "You talk posh," she said matter-of-factly on their first night. "But you've got good hands. Bet you'll be decent with engines." Elizabeth smiled in the dark. If only Mary knew that those hands had been trained in needlepoint and piano, not pistons and carburetors. The training was intense. 6 days a week, they learned to strip down engines, identify problems by sound, and reassemble complex mechanical systems under time pressure. Elizabeth's fingers, accustomed to delicate royal wave, now bore cuts and calluses from handling tools and metal components. Sergeant Thompson, their instructor, was a no-nonsense veteran who'd served in North Africa. He had one rule: "I don't care if your father is the King of England. "If you can't fix this engine, you're no use to me." Elizabeth bit back a smile every time he said it, but she struggled at first. The other girls had grown up around machinery. Their fathers were mechanics, factory workers, engineers. Elizabeth had grown up around horses and oil paintings. When she first attempted to change engine oil, she ended up wearing more than went into the truck. "Here, love," said Betty Morrison, a cheerful girl from Manchester. "Like this. Firm grip, steady hand. You'll get it," and slowly she did. Each day brought new challenges, new skills, new confidence. She learned to diagnose engine troubles by listening to subtle changes in rhythm. She mastered the art of changing tires in under 4 minutes. She could navigate London's bomb-damaged streets in complete blackout conditions, guided only by memory and instinct. The other girls began to respect her not for who she was, which they still didn't know, but for who she was becoming. Someone who didn't quit when things got difficult. Someone who stayed late to help others with their mechanical problems. Someone who volunteered for the most challenging assignments. 3 months into training, Sergeant Thompson pulled her aside. "Lilibet," he said, using the name everyone knew her by, "you've improved more than any recruit I've seen. I'm recommending you for advanced vehicle maintenance." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride that no royal ceremony had ever given her, but her real test was still coming. It was April 3rd, 1945. The war in Europe was in its final stages, but Germany's desperation was making them more dangerous, not less. V-2 rockets still fell on London with terrifying randomness. An intelligence report suggested increased Luftwaffe activity over southern England. Elizabeth had just completed her advanced training and was assigned to night duties, maintaining the fleet of vehicles that would be crucial for evacuation and emergency response if needed. The work was solitary and demanding, but she'd grown to love the quiet concentration it required. She was alone in the garage that Tuesday night, working on a stubborn Bedford truck whose engine had been giving trouble all week. The massive vehicle was essential. It served as a mobile command center that could coordinate rescue operations across 3 counties. But for 2 days it had been refusing to start reliably. Elizabeth had traced the problem to the electrical system. Something was creating an intermittent fault that killed power at random moments. In daylight, with full equipment, it would be a manageable repair. At night, working by torchlight with basic tools, it was a different challenge entirely. She'd been working for 2 hours when she heard it. The low, ominous drone that every British citizen had learned to fear. Aircraft engines, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too methodical. German planes. The air raid siren began its haunting wail across the countryside. Standard protocol was clear. Stop all work, proceed to the nearest shelter, wait for the all clear. But Elizabeth looked at the truck's exposed engine and made a decision that would define her understanding of duty forever. She kept working. The first explosions came from the direction of London, distant flashes on the horizon that lit up the night sky. The bombers were heading for the capital, but their route took them directly overhead. If any planes were damaged and looking for targets of opportunity, the training base would be an obvious choice. Elizabeth's hands moved faster now, her torch clamped between her teeth, tools arranged within easy reach. She could hear other personnel running for shelter, voices calling to each other across the compound. But she also knew that if London was being hit hard, this truck might be the difference between coordinating an effective rescue response and chaos. The electrical fault was in the distributor cap. Corrosion had built up on the contact points, creating resistance that randomly interrupted the spark. A simple problem, but one that required patient, precise work to fix properly. Another wave of explosions, closer this time. The windows of the garage rattled, and dust drifted down from the rafters. Elizabeth's hands remained steady. Strip the corroded contacts, clean each connection point, reassemble with precision, test the circuit. That's when she heard footsteps running across the gravel outside. Lilibet. Mary Chen's voice high with panic. "What are you doing?" "Get to the shelter." "Nearly finished," Elizabeth called back, not looking up from her work. "Are you mad? There are bombs falling." Elizabeth tightened the last connection and straightened up. "Mary, if London gets hit badly tonight, this truck will coordinate the entire southeastern rescue response. Without it working properly, people will die." Mary stared at her in the dim light. "You're serious?" Completely. Another explosion, close enough to rattle their teeth. Mary made her decision and grabbed a second torch. Right then, what do you need me to do? Together, they completed the repairs as bombs fell around them. Elizabeth's steady hands, guided by years of palace discipline, Mary's practical knowledge ensuring nothing was overlooked. When they were finished, Elizabeth turned the ignition key. The engine started immediately, settling into the smooth, reliable rhythm that had been missing for days. They looked at each other and grinned. "Now," Elizabeth said, wiping grease from her hands, "we go to the shelter." But as they walked across the compound, Mary caught something in her companion's profile, something familiar about the way she held herself, the confidence in her stride even after hours of mechanical work. "Lilibet," she said slowly, "what's your surname?" Elizabeth paused at the shelter entrance. For 3 months she'd been just another girl in uniform, just another pair of hands learning to fix engines and drive trucks. But now, covered in grease and oil, having proven herself under fire, she realized she was ready to be herself. "Windsor," she said quietly. Mary stopped walking. "Windsor, as in Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, yes?" The silence stretched between them as the reality sank in. Mary had been sharing a bunk, sharing meals, sharing jokes and complaints and fears with the future Queen of England. "Bloody hell," Mary whispered. "Language, please," Elizabeth said with a small smile. Then they both started laughing, the tension and fear and adrenaline of the night releasing in waves of uncontrollable giggles as they stumbled into the shelter together. Word spread through the training center like wildfire, but not in the way you might expect. Instead of treating Elizabeth differently, the other girls seemed to close ranks around her. They'd grown to respect Lilibet the mechanic, the girl who stayed late to help others, who volunteered for the worst jobs, who just risked her life to fix a truck while bombs fell around them. Learning that she was also a princess somehow made perfect sense. "Well, that explains why you hold your teacup like that," was Betty Morrison's only comment. But the night had changed something deeper than just Elizabeth's identity within the group. For the first time in her life, she'd made a decision based purely on what needed to be done, without considering protocol or royal expectations or what anyone else might think appropriate. She'd put service above safety, duty above personal comfort, and the needs of others above her own well-being. In that garage, with bombs falling and her hands deep in engine grease, she'd discovered what kind of queen she wanted to be. The war ended 5 weeks later. VE Day brought celebrations across Britain and the Commonwealth, and Princess Elizabeth appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with her family, waving to the cheering crowds below. The newspapers photographed her in her elegant dress, her perfect gloves, her carefully arranged hair. But the girl who waved that day was different from the one who'd entered ATS training 4 months earlier. Her hands bore faint scars from tools and engines. Her confidence came not from royal protocol, but from knowing she could fix whatever was broken. Her understanding of leadership had been forged not in palace ballrooms but in military garages. Sergeant Thompson wrote in his final report, "Second Subaltern Windsor demonstrates exceptional mechanical aptitude and vehicle operation skills. More importantly, she shows the kind of leadership that comes not from rank but from character. She leads by example, stays calm under pressure, and puts the mission above personal considerations. She would be an asset to any unit." He never knew how prophetic those words would be. Years later, when Elizabeth became queen, she never forgot the lessons learned in that ATS garage. The girl who'd fixed engines while bombs fell became the woman who'd reigned for over 70 years, facing every crisis with the same steady hands and unflappable resolve. During the tumultuous decades that followed, through political upheavals, family scandals, economic crises, and global pandemics, those who watched closely could still see flashes of the mechanic she'd once been. The way she'd roll up her sleeves, metaphorically speaking, when situations required hands-on attention. The patience she'd show with complex problems that needed careful, methodical solutions. The refusal to abandon her post when things got difficult. The truck she repaired that April night in 1945 went on to serve in the post-war reconstruction efforts, helping coordinate the massive task of rebuilding Britain from the rubble of the Blitz. It became a symbol of the kind of quiet, essential work that makes everything else possible, the unglamorous but vital tasks that keep society functioning. In many ways, it was the perfect metaphor for the kind of monarch Elizabeth would become. Not the flashy figurehead some expected, but the reliable engine that kept the constitutional machinery running smoothly, year after year, decade after decade. The other girls from ATS training scattered across the Commonwealth after the war. Mary Chen emigrated to Australia, where she opened a garage and became one of the country's first female automotive engineers. Betty Morrison returned to Manchester and raised 5 children while working part-time as a mechanic. They all kept in touch, sending Christmas cards and updates about their lives, and every few years, one of them would receive a handwritten note on palace stationery. Not formal royal correspondence, but personal messages signed simply Lilibet, updates about her children, condolences for losses, congratulations for grandchildren. The kind of letters one friend sends to another, because once you've shared a bunk and fixed engines together, while bombs fall around you, royal protocol becomes rather beside the point. The story of Princess Elizabeth's service in the ATS remained relatively unknown to the general public for many years. It was mentioned briefly in royal biographies, usually in a single paragraph between more significant events. But for those who understood leadership, it was perhaps the most revealing chapter of her entire life. In that garage, working by torchlight while under enemy fire, the future queen learned the most important lesson of her reign. True leadership isn't about the crown on your head. It's about the willingness to do whatever needs doing, regardless of whether anyone is watching or applauding. The mechanical skills she learned proved useful in unexpected ways throughout her life. Palace staff grew accustomed to finding the queen with the bonnet of her Land Rover open, diagnosing problems with the same methodical approach she'd learned in 1945. She insisted on driving herself whenever protocol allowed, and mechanical breakdowns never fazed her. "Your Majesty," a nervous security officer once said as she crouched beside a stalled vehicle during an official visit to Scotland, "perhaps we should call for assistance." "Nonsense," she replied, already locating the source of the problem. "It's just a loose connection. Pass me that toolkit, would you?" 20 minutes later, they were back on the road. But the deeper legacy was philosophical. Elizabeth's reign became defined by the same qualities she'd demonstrated in that wartime garage: steadiness under pressure, commitment to service over personal comfort, and the understanding that the most important work is often the least glamorous. She never sought credit for the night she'd risked her life to fix a truck while London was being bombed. She never mentioned it in speeches or interviews. It simply became part of who she was, a woman who understood that duty sometimes means getting your hands dirty, that leadership sometimes means staying at your post when others seek shelter, and that the crown is not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a tool to be used in service of others. Today, as we look back on Queen Elizabeth II's extraordinary 7-decade reign, it's easy to focus on the grand ceremonies, the state visits, the historic moments when she stood before parliaments and peoples as the embodiment of constitutional monarchy. But perhaps we should remember her just as often as the 18-year-old girl with grease under her fingernails, working by torchlight while bombs fell around her, fixing an engine because it needed to be fixed, and she was the one there to do it. In a world increasingly obsessed with celebrity and status, with grand gestures and social media presence, there's something profoundly moving about a future queen who learned her most important lesson while holding a wrench in a military garage. She learned that real leadership isn't about being seen or celebrated or thanked. It's about seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when, especially when, no one else is willing or able to step forward. The girl who fixed trucks in the dark became the woman who held together a nation, a commonwealth, and a monarchy through decades of unprecedented change. Not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the same quiet, steady, reliable service she'd first practiced in that ATS garage in 1945. Every time she faced a crisis, and there were many, she drew on the same resources she'd discovered: that April night, steady hands, clear thinking, and the absolute conviction that duty comes before personal comfort, always and without exception. In the end, that might be the most royal thing about her. Not the crown or the palaces or the ceremonies, but the simple, profound understanding that true nobility comes from service, and true leadership comes from the willingness to do whatever needs doing, even if your hands get dirty in the process. So I ask you, have you ever met someone who understood leadership the way Queen Elizabeth learned it in that garage? Someone who led by example, stayed calm under pressure, and put the mission above their own comfort? Share their story in the comments below. Let's remember the mechanics and the fixers, the people who keep things running while others take the credit. And if this story has shown you a side of the late Queen you'd never heard before, hit that subscribe button. At our channel, we believe the most powerful stories aren't always the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that happen in garages and workshops and forgotten corners, where ordinary people do extraordinary things because they need to be done. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the most important thing you can learn is how to fix what's broken, even when the world is falling apart around you.